If you've wandered down Trafalgar Road, you've likely noticed this unusual house just south of Lawson Street. Built in 1874, this house was first inhabited and built by Captain Francis J. Brown and his family. Captain Brown was many things throughout his storied life. He was a surveyor for the Grand Trunk Railway, he was an oil well investor, and he was also a grain buyer. But most of all, he was a master mariner. His many voyages saw him sail the Great Lakes, the Atlantic Ocean, and the Sea of Japan all throughout the latter half of the 19th century. This was a century marked by the resurgence of European imperial and colonial efforts, and the abolishment of the transatlantic slave trade, among countless other historical moments. Indeed, in his career, Captain Brown seemed to sail in and out of several historical events, including early oil discoveries in Ontario, missionary work along the Niger River with the first African bishop, and the Meiji Restoration in Japan. So join us as we chart this seafarer's far-flung life and career in Oakville and the world beyond. In 1841, Francis J. Brown was born in the village of Ringwood, which is located near the southern coast of England on the Avon River. He was the third of 10 children born to Richard Brown and Mary Ann Pritchard. The Brown family had held positions in the village's administration since the early 1700s, so Richard's occupation as a law clerk followed the family tradition, one that he hoped his sons might also continue. And while some would, his eldest sons Albert and Francis would instead pursue careers at sea, working as mariners across the globe for most of their lives. Their upbringing in Ringwood made a life at sea seem not only possible, but exciting. Many sailors had families in Ringwood and were keen to share stories with the boys. Francis heard many from John Hyder, a merchant mariner who captained Lady Milton. Captain Hyder was known for dramatic stories of his time at sea, which he enjoyed sharing with the wide-eyed village children. It was here that Francis met Hannah Hyder, the captain's daughter, whom he'd one day marry. Francis got his first taste for the wider world at some point between 1853 and 1856, when he was sent to live with an uncle in Quebec. He finished his education there at the Jesuit College in Point Levy and worked for the Grand Trunk Railway in surveying and drafting for a time as a teenager. He eventually returned to England in 1857, determined to make his living at sea. He began his 4 years as an apprentice then. Over the course of his apprenticeship, he sailed on 3 different ships, and he recalled later in life that the crew and captain of the first ship were not particularly kind to him as a young cabin boy. He endured all manner of physical abuse at their hands to the point where he began to fight back. And evidently he fought fiercely, for, quote, all hands found that it paid to let him alone, and he devoted his time to his duties and the study of his profession. He completed his apprenticeship in 1861 and joined Captain Hyder's crew aboard the Lady Milton for 6 months the following year as a seaman. In December 1862, he attained his certificate of competency as a second mate, which qualified him to sail in the merchant service. All throughout these years, Francis continued to maintain a faithful correspondence with Hannah Hyder, who remained at home in Ringwood. He expressed his growing interest in the wider world to her in a letter.
The world is opening up, and I believe that ere long importing and exporting will involve the countries of all continents. Even Japan is welcoming trade, and it's hard for me to realize that I was only 12 when Perry crashed her ports with his 3 black ships. I am fascinated by recent developments in the nautical world.
By the time Francis was 23 in 1864, news of Britain's overseas colonies and former colonies in North America broke the British headlines, advertising Great Lakes shipping and the logging and lumber industries. Francis's uncle in Quebec wrote to his nephew, "Take advantage of new developments in a land of opportunity." After some deliberation, Francis decided that he would return to Canada and do so. Having some sailing experience already, he planned to find work as a mariner in what was then Canada West and East. He joined a lake steamer as a senior crew member and sailed regularly throughout the Great Lakes, making trips from Montreal to as far as Duluth until word spread of an oil discovery in Canada West. It wasn't the first. The oil industry in Ontario began in 1850, some 15 years before Francis's departure from England, in oil springs and then later in Petrolia. The boom that Francis heard of was in nearby Bothwell, now located within the municipality of Chatham, Kent. Francis likely arrived in Bothwell in 1865. The oil boom began 2 years earlier and had been facilitated by American investor and surveyor John M. Lick. Lick had found the Bothwell pay zone, and his well was quite successful. Francis got to know Lick not long after he arrived, which helped him to get settled in the rapidly booming town. Bothwell grew from a small village of 500 to a bustling town of 10,000, with 25 hotels, a music hall, and many bars in a matter of a few years. Business, however, was unstable in the oil fields. Fortune could turn overnight if a well went to salt water. Regardless, Francis invested in a well and stuck it out for a year. Toward the end of 1866, Hannah Hyder, her mother Jane, and her brother James all sailed for Canada, and Francis and Hannah were soon married. Their marriage, and the impending birth of their first child, was incentive enough to leave Bothwell. And not a moment too soon, for Bothwell's oil fields swung from boom to bust that year. Fortunately for the Browns, Francis sold his well before the worst of the bust, and the proceeds from the sale helped the newlyweds to settle in Oakville, where they would live for the next 3 decades. According to the 1871 census for Oakville, Francis was occupied then, and likely since the Browns' arrival to town in 1867, as a merchant. His first employer was Henry Hogbin, who hired him as a grain buyer for his brewery on the west side of what's now Trafalgar Road, roughly at the end of McDonald's Road. Francis took it over in 1870 and renamed it the Victoria Brewery. However, times were very tough in Oakville, and the brewery remained idle for 4 years. It looks like Francis pursued other mercantile ventures in the meantime. A notice for Brown and Hyder's store was placed in the Argus newspaper on September 20th, 1873, advertising that
Notice: parties desiring their winter supply of coal must leave their orders for the same at Brown and Hyder's store during the present month of September.
the Hyder named here is likely Hannah's brother James, who was also a resident of Oakville and likely lived with the Browns. By 1876, however, he was a merchant in his own right and married Emma Frances Romaine at St. Jude's Anglican Church. In 1874, Francis sold the Victoria Brewery to William B. and Charles P. Chisholm. The Chisholm brothers converted the building into the Oakville Basket Factory, which would become a flagship industry in town and remain in operation until 1984. In 1920, however, the original building burned down, and the basket factory was rebuilt at the corner of Trafalgar Road and Cornwall Road. Quite finished with being a merchant, Francis returned to the Great Lakes and did well for himself as a qualified mariner. He was finally able to have this house built on Trafalgar Road for his family. Hannah's mother, Jane, obtained a mortgage for the property, and the house was built not long after in the mid-1870s. It was described as an imposing one for those times, but it had more than enough space for the Brown family, which now counted 4 children: Henry, Francis, Mary Ann, and Emma. When the house was first completed, it featured a tent-shaped veranda, a narrow widow's walk, and a low balustrade around the belvedere atop the roof. The widow's walk and balustrade have since been removed, though the belvedere itself remains. As an Anglican family, the Browns attended St. Jude's. Hannah and her mother did so regularly, and Francis joined when he was ashore. In 1876, just after George Pritchard, who was their 5th child, was born, a representative from the Church Missionary Society spoke at a Sunday service about missionary work in Africa. The Church Missionary Society, or the CMS, traces its roots to the mid-1700s and the general rise of missionary activity at that time. The missionary efforts were clustered in West Africa and based out of Freetown, Sierra Leone, where their presence was bolstered by British colonial administration and influence. The representative at St. Jude's discussed ongoing efforts to proselytize and provide relief to those yet suffering under slavery, which persisted internally in Africa, though the transatlantic slave trade was abolished in the British Empire in 1807 and had mostly ceased by 1867. The representative spoke specifically about the Niger Mission, which was established along the Niger River in the 1850s. The CMS faced great difficulty visiting and supplying the mission without a proper ship to sail up the river, so they planned to commission a shallow river vessel for that purpose. Missionary work was quite common in this period. The 1800s saw the British Empire spread physically, politically, and intellectually across the globe, and the British viewed an important part of that growth to be the work of Christian missionaries spreading their faith to colonized states all over the world. The CMS specifically focused their efforts on Africa for much of the 1800s, which coincided with increased attention on the continent from European nations seeking new colonies. Like most Christians at the time, Francis firmly believed in missionary work. Determined to contribute, Francis rushed to speak to the CMS representative as the service concluded and volunteered to captain the ship for the proposed expedition, set for 1878. With his experience in freshwater navigation on the Great Lakes, he was a good fit for a river voyage, and he was eager to be at sea again. In a letter to his brother Albert, he wrote,
"It may please you to hear that I have at last taken your advice and applied myself to finding a position at sea. The Church of England is entering on a serious and important work, namely to aid the African cause by going there with material assistance for the men and women who have been labouring for a long time under great difficulties. My dear Hannah is entirely willing, nay, even enthusiastic, although she knows the journey entails dangers. She also knows, however, that the whole venture excites me to a happy enthusiasm."
The rest of Oakville seemed to share his excitement. At a farewell meeting held for him, Francis was presented with the following letter, which was signed by the mayor, prominent citizens, and master mariners of Oakville. The undersigned have heard with unfeigned pleasure and satisfaction of your appointment under the auspices of the Church Missionary and Royal Geographical Societies of England to the command of a steamer destined for the exploration of the river Niger on the west coast of Africa. And they ask you to accept the accompanying ensign, being that of the Dominion of Canada, that it may remind you that as an esteemed friend and Canadian Englishman you live in their memory, that you may carry it with you to the land of your labours. The ensign was a Canadian red ensign, a flag that preceded our current flag and was used by Canadians on land and sea from as early as 1868 right up until 1965, when the maple leaf flag was adopted. The letter also bears a faint imprint of the original town of Oakville seal. This seal was first established in 1857, but it was destroyed in a fire sometime after this letter was created. This letter is the only document known to bear the original seal. And though it's incredibly faint, the bylaw that established the seal described it as a shield containing, in quarters, a ship to represent commerce, an engine to represent manufacturing, a sheaf of wheat for agriculture, and an oak tree for the town's stability and prosperity. Francis set out from Oakville in 1877, and his first stop was Renfrew, Scotland, just down the River Clyde from Glasgow. There they would board the ship for the voyage, a paddle steamer named after Henry Venn, who was an influential secretary for the Church Missionary Society. Given that the Henry Venn was a riverboat, ill-suited to the open ocean, their voyage to Africa would be cautious and involve calling in a few ports. Francis described it to his son in a letter as such. They would leave Renfrew down the River Clyde and out into the Irish Sea. From there, they would follow the English coast down to Falmouth, where they would restock coal and wait for favourable weather to cross the English Channel. The Henry Venn would dock briefly on Madeira before heading south for Sierra Leone, their first destination in Africa. Upon arrival in Sierra Leone, Francis hoisted the ensign flag he received in Oakville.
"I bent it on the signal pole yard and hoisted it at the foremast head. This, I claim, was the first time the emblem of our country ever flew in Africa. At any rate, I know it to be the first time it ever flew in Sierra Leone. I would hoist it at every stopping place on the coast, and it flew at every mission station on the great Niger River."
In his observations of Freetown, Sierra Leone, he noted that it was the only harbor for large ships, and that it contained fine public buildings, churches, and schools, many of which were run by the CMS, as well as a college known as the Fora Bay Institution. After 6 weeks docked in Freetown, the Henry Venn set out for Lagos, where they would meet the Bishop of West Africa. The Bishop of West Africa was Samuel Ajayi Crowther. It was he who arranged for this expedition, as well as gathered the funds for the Henry Venn. Crowther was consecrated as Bishop of West Africa in 1864, and was the first African to hold such a high position in the Anglican Church. It was actually the namesake of Francis's ship, Henry Venn, who had supported his appointment to the position. He also sent Crowther to open the Niger mission in 1857, as per Venn's personal philosophy regarding mission work. Venn supported the three selves principle, the belief that a new church should become self-propagating, self-financing, and self-governing. That way, the European missionary could move on to found new missions, while, in this case, the African pastors remained to continue the work. This principle was not universally upheld, as it starkly contradicted the predominant racist views of many European missionaries. As such, the borders of Crowther's diocese were ambiguously defined as, quote, the countries of Western Africa beyond the limits of our dominions. This carefully excluded the British colonies of Lagos, Sierra Leone, and the Gold Coast, as prevailing racial attitudes meant that it was not possible to install a black bishop over white settlers in those colonies. In A Rope in the Hand, a biography of Francis J. Brown by Jesse L. Beatty, she includes a retelling of Crowther's life story as he told it to Francis, who in turn carefully recorded it in his report to the CMS. Though Britain abolished slavery in the Empire earlier in the 1800s, the slave trade persisted, so British ships began capturing slave ships departing Africa and returning the freed Africans to Freetown. Crowther himself was captured by slavers as a young boy of 12 and freed in such a fashion in 1819. He attended CMS schools in Freetown alongside numerous other children who'd been similarly kidnapped and temporarily enslaved, and most of those children were converted to Christianity over the course of their schooling. Crowther went on to become the first student of the Fora Bay Institution, which is today the University of Sierra Leone. Many of the missionaries who staffed the Niger mission were similarly recruited from those who studied at Fora Bay. With Bishop Crowther aboard his ship and their supplies loaded, Francis and the Henry Venn were ready to set out toward the Niger River. They docked first at the Brass Mission Station, which was under the care of a pastor known to Francis as Mr. Johnson, who was the bishop's son-in-law. There they visited a mission school that housed and taught 200 children. Their journey up the river was slow. Many members of the crew fell sick with fevers and other illnesses, and Francis himself took ill at one point. On the whole, though, they were welcomed with relief by the mission workers, who were very grateful for the much-needed supplies that the Henry Venn brought, and glad to know that they hadn't been forgotten by either the mission or the CMS. Francis wrote with considerable pride about what they were able to accomplish in the language of a devout Christian and British subject at the height of imperial zeal.
Every day which I spent with Bishop Crowther on our long journey up the difficult river, I learned to admire his courage the more. Proudly I watched as under its sheltering fold Bishop Crowther had brought many a little escaped slave child who could not safely be left at the mission station in case of an attempt to capture them. Once they stood under the flag of our dominion, they were safe, for we then removed them to some other station beyond the reach of their would-be captors. These children would be sent finally to Sierra Leone, where they would be educated as British subjects. I recall at least 23 little slaves who obtained their freedom beneath my flag. The privilege of assisting them was one of the happiest in my entire life.
The Henry Venn traveled approximately 750 miles up the river. At that point, they realized that the water level was falling and it would not be safe to proceed. And so, the Henry Venn turned around and returned to the Brass Mission Station after 4 months on the Niger. It was Francis's hope to continue with this kind of work. Prior to this expedition, he had even interviewed for the opportunity to captain another ship on the east coast of Africa. He had come to respect both Bishop Crowther and the work of his diocese immensely during their voyage up the Niger. However, Francis had no way to know how the tide of racial and colonial attitudes had turned. He did not realize that there were powerful people in the CMS who strove to reassert white European authority in West Africa. Opposition to Bishop Crowther was growing, and with it, opposition to his supporters. When Francis was passed over for the next expedition, he wrote to Dandison Coates Crowther, Archdeacon of the Niger and a son of Bishop Crowther, whom he had met and worked with while on their expedition. He wrote in the hopes that Archdeacon Crowther might be able to paint a better picture of Francis than the CMS official aboard the Henry Venn had. Archdeacon Crowther replied that he could certainly vindicate Francis's, quote, Christian and upright conduct, his gentlemanly bearing, and above all the absence of that prejudice of color which is the stumbling block of many of our European brethren out here. It was perhaps the latter that saw him dismissed from the CMS. However, another opportunity soon presented itself to Francis in the form of his brother Albert. Albert was now employed by the Japanese government and urged Francis to join him there. Francis agreed, and after a short visit home in 1879, he set off for Japan. Francis's employment in Japan came in the midst of a period of tremendous change. 20 years earlier, the ports of Japan were forcibly reopened to the world after 264 years of sakoku, a policy of national isolation enacted by the Tokugawa shogunate, or the military government, in the 1600s. As Francis himself put it, Perry crashed her ports with his 3 black ships. Indeed, American Commodore Matthew Perry had spurred a scramble in the West to capitalize on the ports he'd wrenched open in 1853. Japan was pressed to agree to unfair treaties for regular relations and trade with the United States as well as several European nations at the business end of a warship. The shogunate was swiftly removed from power in 1868 by another group of samurai leaders dissatisfied with the situation. This sparked the Meiji Restoration, so named for the restoration of Emperor Meiji to power. From 1871 to 1873, the Meiji government sent officials to various Western nations. They assessed what institutional structures might be worth adopting in Japan, as per a central edict of the Meiji Restoration. Seek knowledge from the whole world to strengthen imperial rule. The Meiji government determined that radical westernization was necessary to retain their sovereignty and do away with the unfair trade treaties. To that end, the Meiji government hired around 3,000 Westerners to ease the infusion of Western ideas of law, military, education, science, medicine, commerce, and more into Japanese society. They would transform Japan entirely over the course of just a few decades, all in the aim of strengthening and unifying the country. Francis was employed by the Meiji government 10 years into this movement of sweeping domestic and social reforms. It's safe to say that Francis somewhat undersold the magnitude of the Meiji Restoration in a letter to Hannah, saying only,
"What a change, I believe, in less than 50 years."
An excellent example of a Western recruit is none other than Francis's brother, Albert. The Meiji government recruited him from the Peninsular and Oriental Steam Navigation Company in 1869. Albert liaised with British shipyards and purchased steamships on the Meiji government's behalf. He was appointed advisor to the Bureau of Posts and Communications and drew up plans for a bureau to oversee shipping and shipbuilding. He also helped set up the Tokyo Mercantile Marine College. Albert took an interest in Francis' career in Japan. He helped Francis to find his early employment with Kyoto Unyu Kaisha, a transportation company that sailed many British ships. In his first year in Japan, Francis sailed the Takasago Maru along the Japanese coastline, laying out the locations for new lighthouses and buoys.
Important work to be done here for the protection of many ships now coming and going in trade with other countries.
There are more than 60 lighthouses from the Meiji era still standing in Japan today. Francis also transported medical supplies up and down the coast during a cholera outbreak, which he found particularly rewarding. Francis was later presented with a letter of thanks from the Japanese government for his exemplary work regulating medical inspections during the outbreak. Regardless of what he was doing, though, he certainly seemed to enjoy the sights. In a letter to Hannah, he remarked,
"I wish I had the time and the vocabulary to describe the scenes of beauty which I observe as I travel up and down the coasts among the many islands. There are few places from which one cannot see the magnificent Mount Fuji, which surely directs the eyes heavenward."
In 1885, Kyoto Unyu Kaisha merged with its rival, Mitsubishi, to establish Nippon Yusen Kaisha, better known as the NYK Line, which still operates as a shipping and transportation company today. Francis would work as a captain for the NYK Line for the remainder of his career. The opportunity for a visit home came in 1882, likely spurred by Albert's influence. Despite Francis's time away, his family had remained in his thoughts. From the first letter he sent Hannah from a ship in Japan, he noted that,
"I am sending you some gifts which I have chosen with delight for you. I hope they will emphasize the fact that you are hourly in my thoughts. There will be others sent to you as I journey from place to place."
And so there were. Francis docked in countless ports throughout Asia, and in each one he located at least a few gifts to send home to Hannah and the children, now numbering 6 with the addition of Bertha. These gifts of rare beauty from many lands began to fill the family home in Oakville. He sent ivories, china, bronzes, carvings of sawa wood, bolts of silk, embroideries, tapestries, paintings, handmade jewelry, and vases. By 1889, Hannah realized that the house was well and truly full. Francis was visiting home at the time, so Hannah pointed out that perhaps they didn't need so many beautiful art pieces for themselves. They opened their home to the people of the town as an exhibition and sold whatever people wanted to buy. It must have been successful, because Hannah and the children continued to sell pieces from the collection, even after Francis returned to his work at sea. But before he went, a supper was given in Francis's honor at the Murray House Hotel, which saw, according to Constable George Sumner, a big crowd, and all who attended had a good time. Francis didn't record much in terms of any achievements he made while working for the Japanese government or the NYK line, but we know that he received gifts for his service. Like his brother Albert, he received the Order of the Sacred Treasure, 6th class, from the Emperor of Japan in 1895. This award was established by Emperor Meiji in 1888 for the recognition of long and/or meritorious civil or military service. It was also in 1895 that Francis finally considered retirement, though he expressed some wistfulness at leaving his work and Japan behind. As he wrote to Hannah,
I am in love with the Orient. Of course it ranks second in my loves, as you know. But were it advisable or possible, I would happily transport our residence to Japan.
by this time, the Brown children, now grown, had begun to pursue their own futures. The eldest, Henry, joined a grocery business in Illinois, and Marianne and Emma went into teaching. Frank, the second eldest, apprenticed to a watchmaker and quickly became expert enough to open his own shop in Galt, which is now part of Cambridge, Ontario. Hannah and Francis sold their home in Oakville in 1896 and moved to Galt as well. The Brown family's departure was felt throughout Oakville. They were part of the community for nearly 30 years, and the town had welcomed the exhibition and sale of their many curios with interest and excitement. The sale of such items was so profitable that the family thought they might expand the small venture into an actual business. In partnership with Frank's existing business, the Brown family opened the Oriental Bazaar, the name being, of course, a product of its time. It reflected the kind of items they sold there and says quite a bit about the novelty and exoticism wrapped up in Asian artworks and curios in the late 1800s and early 1900s. Much of that novelty simply came from how little people in Canada knew about the countries of the East. The bazaar featured a constantly changing display of items as Francis continued to ship them home and maintained contact with agents who continued to do so on his behalf after retirement. Francis also supplied Hannah with descriptions and other information about the items he shipped back to Canada, which Hannah and those of the children who worked in the shop, likely Emma and Bertha, and of course Frank himself, passed on to those purchasing them. The shop expanded over the years to accommodate the sale of jewelry, as their supply of goods slowed through the First and Second World Wars. Eventually, the name Oriental Bazaar was dropped in favor of a singular name, F.J. Brown & Son, which remains a successful family-owned shop in downtown Cambridge today. Francis enjoyed just over a decade of retirement before passing away in 1909. When he was buried, his casket was draped with the same ensign flag he took with him up the Niger River in 1878. He was buried in Galt. Hannah would outlive him by many, many years, living to be 100 years old. In 1896, the Globe newspaper ran a short interest piece about Francis. The old gentleman tells his stories quietly and simply, with not a trace of egotism, wrote the journalist, and to hear him is to a Canadian like listening to a tale from another world or age. This was true then, and it's true now, and he certainly gives us an interesting story to go with such an interesting house. I'd like to thank all those who helped to make this video possible. A special thank you goes to Alan Walker for your tireless research across the pond in England, which helped us to uncover Francis's early life and family history. We would not have the photographs of Ringwood seen here, nor the documents illuminating Francis's early sailing career without Alan's efforts. Thank you also to Ted and Dave Brown, as well as all the folks from F.J. Brown & Son down in Cambridge, for welcoming us into your business and graciously sharing your family history and artifacts with us. And of course, a huge thank you to John Oldham for lending us your voice and in turn giving a voice to the captain himself.
Looking for more great content like this? Why not check out the Oakville Historical Society website, YouTube channel, or Facebook and Instagram pages?